Good morning, everyone. Again, we'll try to settle in. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for this panel. I want to try to get started on time. I want to first just make a few announcements before we get started and turn the panel over to Dave Basler. If you aren't already informed, the racing forms are in the back corner on the desk. So be sure to pick one up if you haven't. Also, our goal is to end the panel around 11 a.m. this morning. Originally, we were under the impression that the post time was a little after 12, but first post today is at 1 o'clock. So our first bus is set to leave between 11:15 and 11:30. Our second bus is going to leave between 11:45 and 12. So they'll be right out front. If you have any questions, just see Audria right out front to make sure where to get on the buses. Again, the first post is at 1 o'clock, and the last post is at 5:03. The first bus coming back here will be about 3:15, and then the last bus, of course, will be about 20 minutes after the last race. Okay. So today, ending the convention as it has historically since I've been here, we are ending with the Kent Stirling Memorial Medication Panel. Once again, Dr. Tobin has helped put together an almost stellar group of panelists, and I say almost because I'm actually up here today. I will leave it for Dave Basler to do the introductions, but I do want to again thank our sponsors that helped us fund this panel. Once again, the Ohio HBPA, the Arizona HBPA, the Kentucky HBPA, and the affiliates in Washington and Oregon, their HBPAs. So I'll turn it now over to Dave Basler, Executive Director of the Ohio HBPA, and also our Medication and Model Rules Committee Chairman.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks, everyone, for getting up early and coming out for the medication panel. As Eric mentioned, this is dedicated to Kent Stirling, and Kent was a tireless advocate for HBPA members around the country on all medication issues, and he spent a lot of his time putting together medication panels for, at that time, 2 conventions a year, and invariably, they were the most informative panels of the entire convention, and that happened convention after convention. Kent would be very happy with the panel that Dr. Tobin put together today. They are all experts in their fields. We have Dr. Tobin, Dr. Wayne Duer, and Dr. Clara Fenger. Dr. Tobin, I don't believe, needs any real introduction to most of the people in this room. He's the longtime National HBPA Medication Advisor, but more so than that, he is a world-renowned equine toxicologist. He's the longtime director of the University of Gluck Equine Research Toxicology Center, and he has testified in literally thousands of medication cases across the U.S. for the last 30 years. Dr. Clara Fenger graduated with her degree in veterinary medicine from UC Davis, obtained her master's degree from my university, Ohio State, and her PhD from the University of Kentucky. She is a tireless advocate for horsemen on medication issues. Several years back, while practicing equine medicine in Kentucky, she saw a need to organize the practicing vets across the country. Their voice just wasn't being heard, and trying to organize any group that's across the country is like herding cats, and Clara single-handedly put that group together. They're now in their 4th year. The North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians, they're gaining respect across the industry, and they've been great advocates of ours in ensuring that we get a fair shake on medication issues. Clara is also an expert witness and is testifying in a large percentage of cases that end up in court in the last 2 or 3 years, including the expert witness in the methamphetamine case in New Jersey, which the Grayson Commission's ruling was just overturned on, the Joe Sharp case. And very happy to have with us today Dr. Wayne Duer. Dr. Duer is a renowned both mathematician and forensic toxicologist with over 40 years of experience. He is published in many scientific articles, statistician that has no equal in the industry, in my opinion, and we're very lucky to have him with us here today. And the order today is going to be, well, no, it's not going to be as you see them seated. It's going to be Dr. Tobin, then Dr. Fenger, and then Dr. Duer.
Thank you, Dave, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come down here and to speak. I'm going to speak today about Aminorex and Pemeline, and it's a rather interesting story, and it's a story that just popped up 12 months ago. I didn't know a thing about this, and I'm going to tell you what happened in the last 12 months, and it's ongoing. Now, let me just see how I can... I guess I have to watch my slides here in front. No, we're fine. How do I get the... Okay. My name is Thomas Tobin, and I work in the Gluck Equine Research Center. And I'm going to speak today about a plant that grows in Kentucky called yellow rocket. It's a plant that yields Aminorex, and I've got question mark Pemeline. Aminorex is an amphetamine-related substance, closely structurally related. It's a central stimulant. It's a DEA1 substance. And this story is how it comes out of Kentucky pastures and how we figured that out in the last 12 months. Just so that you know what we're talking about, these are the number of Aminorex and Pemeline identifications 2000 to date. Now, I'm not at all sure about the figures down here. These came from the ARCI, but you can see here that we have a small number of Aminorexes, 5 in Massachusetts, and we had no idea where they were coming from. Illinois, Massachusetts, Iowa, Ohio. Pemelines, we had a significant number in New York in 2012. Dr. Malin assured me that they came from a levamisole administration. Levamisole metabolizes to Aminorex, and then we believe there's reasonably good evidence it metabolizes to Pemeline in some horses. But we had a bunch in Indiana that were actually reported to ARCI, and there's another little story coming there. So let's just get into the actual source of this material. Yellow rocket is Barbaria vulgaris, and in about another 6 weeks or so, if you're driving around Kentucky and Ohio, you can see it. You will rarely see it as widespread as this, but you will certainly see it in corners of pastures where it's not mowed, and the yellow rocket grows. Now, Aminorex is an amphetamine-related ARCI class 1 substance, and these were appearing unrelated to levamisole administrations. We knew from the 2007 activity that if you give levamisole to a horse, it's metabolized to Aminorex, but now we were having Aminorex show up and we didn't know where they were coming from. And this is a summary. English colleagues suggested barbarin, a plant material, as a source of identifications. Barbarin is found in yellow rocket. It's in the plant to discourage herbivores from eating it. It's a stay away from meat substance in the plant, and it works. The plant is very widespread in North America, and in fact, its relatives are widespread around the world. We harvested Kentucky yellow rocket in April, May, sent it to George Malin for equine administration. When he presented the plant to the horses, they declined to eat it. They didn't like the look of it. But he put it in sweet feed and they ate it, and bingo, he had an Aminorex positive in the urine. That's the summary. Here's what's actually going on. This is back to the plant again. But what is going on in the plant, and forgive me for the structure, but if you look at this substance here, this is Amidorex, and that ring there is a phenyl group, and we have another ring here with the nitrogen and oxygen, and we have exactly the same structure of barbarin. The phenyl group, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and instead of an amino group here, we have a sulfur. The plant, if you take the plant and damage it, this material, glucobarbarin, breaks down and forms barbarin, which discourages the horse from eating it, and apparently it metabolizes somewhere between the plant and the horse urine. You get Amidorex. So I'm pretty sure it happens in the horse, but that's another little question. Okay, since 2007, we've known that it's a metabolite of levamisole. Avoid levamisole. In England, they had Amidorex identifications in sport horses, in show horses, no levamisole plants, in no levamisole history, and they had plant substances in the urine which led them. Now, it's fair to say that our English colleagues identified barbarin as the possible source. They looked at it carefully, and they figured that out. What didn't hurt at all was at about the same time as this was happening, we had Amidorex identifications in Kentucky racing. And when I went to Dubai about in March last year, heard this from the English folks, came back, and Dr. Sams suggested that we synthesize barbarin, and I want to acknowledge Dr. Sam's contribution. He sent me the synthetic method. He had run into it as a very young researcher. So we went ahead and synthesized it, and we published it. And then Mother Nature, we had some good colleagues, Dr. Sams and Mother Nature. Mother Nature produced the yellow rocket plant in Kentucky pasture in April 2018. We harvested it. We had it certified by a professional plant scientist, Professor Green, and we shipped it to Dr. Malin for administrations. As I said, the New York horses declined to eat the yellow rocket, so we hid it in sweet feed and they ate it. Post-administration, the samples tested positive for Amidorex. Yellow rocket, which grows in Kentucky and in fact across North America, is now a potential source of, and I assume they're trace level Amidorex identifications. This was an immediate explanation for the occasional clusters and occasional individual low concentration Amidorex identifications in U.S. racing and elsewhere, not associated with levamisole administration. We have sent this out for publication, and we're in the process of getting it published. We keep our fingers crossed on these things. This is the data from Professor Malin. Here is his 4-hour post, here his blank urine, here's his 4-hour post-administration, 8-hour, and here's his reference standard. So he was quite comfortable that he had Amidorex in the urines of these horses. So barbarin in yellow rocket and hay feedstuff is a potential source of Amidorex, an ARCI class 1 substance, a pretty significant identification if you don't have a good innocent source. No obvious way I don't know of any way to clearly guarantee that the feeds are free of barbarin-containing plants. Plasma concentration of Amidorex in these horses are presumably low. George estimated that concentrations were in the order of a nanogram or so. Dr. Sams, when I asked him, thought that his concentrations were higher, but that's an area that chemists unfortunately tend to leave a little vague what the concentrations are. I ran by Rick, one of the characteristics of a urine is Amidorex is what we call a basic or an alkaline drug. And if the horse is producing an acidic urine, the drug will trap in the urine and be there in much higher concentrations. I asked him whether there was any evidence of this, and he didn't seem to think there was, but I'd like to actually see the data. So it's critically important to report the concentration detected, so we get an idea of what kind of background levels we can expect to see in horse urines associated with barbarin. You'd like to see the urinary pH and specific gravity, which some jurisdictions produce but don't because it may affect the concentration of the drug. And of course, we would expect that it would not be detected in plasma because the concentrations are very low indeed. in any event. So that's the barberin story. The Imirex story. Now, as we speak, Kentucky has 3 on the books Imirex identifications and has taken no regulatory action on these. Rick was in contact with the folks in England and knew that there were potential other sources. Concentrations low, presumably not present in plasma, but we don't know. In 21, forgive me, I mistyped there. That should be 2017. Massachusetts had a cluster of 5 Imirex identifications, source unknown, testing by industrial, apparently non-reported since 2018. And as I said, we have a small number in Illinois and 3 Imirex identifications at this time. Now, I'm going to speak to you about a second related substance, and this is a story that I'm going to describe a pattern out there that is concerning, and I'm personally pretty sure at this time that pemmiline will also turn out to be a substance turning up from an innocent botanical source. This is, forgive me again, Imirex here. You got the phenyl group as we discussed, you got the oxygen, you got the nitrogen, and another nitrogen here, and we've got an oxygen here on pemmiline. It's an oxidation product of Imirex. And we were contacted about 5, 7, 8, maybe 10 years, actually time flies, 8 years at least ago now, by some English traders who had administered levamisole to a horse, and they had identified pemmiline in the urine. And we looked at the chemistry. I should say that my chemical colleagues looked at the chemistry. We said this is a simple oxidation product. This is highly likely that these pemmilines are associated with the levamisole administration. And for what it's worth, the British Horse Racing Association accepted that explanation, and it was considered helpful. Pemmiline is also an ARCI Class 1 penalty Class A substance. It was marketed at one time as Silert, a central nervous system stimulant. The dose to produce an effect in the human is very large, and the terminal plasma half-life is extremely long. So if you had exposure to something that was giving rise to pemmiline over a long period, you would gradually have it accumulate in the urine, which is something to keep in mind. But what really surprised me was that in France and in Belgium, pemmilines of unknown origins have long been observed in equine urines, and I understand there's a cutoff in place in Belgium. In fact, what happened here was the French lab sent some samples to Hong Kong for analysis, and if you send a sample to Hong Kong from anywhere outside Hong Kong, they will go over it with a fine-tooth comb, and they reported back that there was pemmiline in the sample, and the French researchers looked at it, and sure enough, there was. And that came out of these discussions, and that would have been about 2 years ago. Now, where are these European pemmilines coming from? And the question becomes, is barberin or a plant-related substance a source of low-concentration pemmiline identifications in the United States and worldwide? And that's a question at the moment. I can't say for sure that what's going on, but I'm going to show you. We had 10 pemmiline identifications in New York done since, and since I made that slide, George told me that he believed these were associated with the levamisole administration. 1 in Oklahoma, 1 in Iowa, and 205 done since. Now, this is interesting. I was contacted, let me jump ahead a second. I was contacted about a year ago by the folks in Indiana, and they told me that the Indiana horsemen were being notified by the Racing Commission that they had pemmilines in their urines and to stop using levamisole. And the problem with that was the horsemen were not using levamisole, and they were still getting these pemmiline identifications in their urine. So I was contacted by the Indiana folks and also by Dr. Fenger and the NARV group, and I called up the lab. I know Petra, known Petra a long time, called her up and says, hey, Petra, what's going on? And basically what happened was there was a little dancing around, and the whole situation calmed down. And I think what happened was basically Petra stopped reporting these low-level pemmiline identifications. So then preparing this seminar, I asked for the number of pebblin identifications from ARCI, and I find that there were 10 in Indiana in June, July 2016, done since. And I haven't had a chance to visit with the Indiana folks, but I assume that these were not in thoroughbred racing. And if anybody has any comments, I'd be happy to know. We have one in Massachusetts, one in Oklahoma, and then this is the Indiana 2018 story. Verbally warning, republic identifications warning since ceased. And we had one in Minnesota, one or two, I've got a question mark there, and we don't know whether they're Vabasol related or not. So back again, here are the pebblin identifications. This is the group in Indiana that was reported to ARCI in 16, and then I was contacted in 18 about verbal reports that were not being acted on. So the question is, where are these pemmeline identifications coming from? And I'm pretty sure that they're actually chemically pemmelline and at low concentrations. And Petra did share with me she tests Peruvian samples, and there was a whole bunch of pemmellines in Peruvian samples, and I asked her for permission to follow that up, but for one reason or another, that was not pursued. This is the verbal pemmelline story. Contact 18 about verbal warnings, pemmelline traces of thoroughbred horses in Indiana Grand, apparently unrelated to the 2016 identifications. Horsemen being warned not to use the Vabasol, horsemen not using the Vabasol confused. Spoke with the laboratory, the verbal warning problem has resolved, and what is not resolved at all is the source of these apparent identifications. So pemmellines of unknown origin, long reported in France, Belgium, significant numbers in Indiana racing, some apparently called, some verbal warnings, anecdotal reports of pemmelline in Peruvian racing, trace level urinary pemmelline identifications of unknown origin are apparently occurring and should be treated with regulatory caution. I'd like to acknowledge my longtime support. Thank you for listening to the presentation, and I'd like to acknowledge my longtime support from the various national and state Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association groups. Thank you very much indeed.
So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Clara Fenger. Dave, I don't know how this, okay. So there we go. So I've had the dubious honor of, I'm not going to say taking over for, but stepping in the shoes of Steve Barker on doing a lot of the positive, being an expert witness in a lot of the positive test cases across the country. I've testified in California, New Mexico, Texas, Kentucky, Maryland, Massachusetts, Maine. There's others. So that's kind of a dubious honor because Dr. Steve Barker has big shoes to fill, but he helps me and so does Dr. Tobin, so we're making progress. What I'm going to talk about today is feed, forage, and bedding. The increased sensitivity in drug testing has resulted in a number of things being called positives that would have never been called before. One of the things that Hong Kong has done, they can only do this in Hong Kong because all of their feed, forage, and bedding comes over on a barge. And what they do is they've imposed limits on the alkaloids that are present in the incoming feed, hay, and bedding in order to prevent positive tests. Now, we can't really do that in the rest of the world because all of our substances don't come in a single source like that. So what would really make more sense is to have rational thresholds and just rational discourse with our regulators on these subjects. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is tulip poplars and glaucine. Tulip poplars are a popular landscape tree. This is an example of a really pretty one. And this is what the leaves are classically look like. They also grow wild, and so they're used as lumber for producing, and commonly, it's one of the most common sources of wood to build your barn. So it's relatively inexpensive, and it's similar to pine in its consistency. And so actually a lot of barns, if not most barns, certainly in my part of the country, are actually made of poplar. It's an excellent source of bedding. It's low dust, highly absorbent, and it's available both as bagged, as in this example, and bulk shavings. Now, tulip poplar has in it a substance called glaucine. Probably hasn't been a big problem for most of us because the jurisdictions where this has been a problem have mostly been THA jurisdictions. But it's kind of a problem because there are actually other natural sources of glaucine besides shavings. The yellow-horned poppy, known as Glaucium flavium, is native to Europe and Africa, grows along the coast, but it's also been introduced into the United States, found mostly in the eastern U.S. Oh, wait, those are those THA states I was telling you about, Mid-Atlantic. But that's not all. There's a plant, there's this tree, no one's ever seen one of these because it grows in South America, but the dragon's blood tree, it's called dragon's blood because if you cut the bark, the sap has got this red blood-like color. So you've never seen one of these trees. You may have seen this. There's a number of diarrhea products that are on the market that are made from the Croton lecheri tree. And then cordalis, or the Chinese tooth violet, this is a common constituent of, a number of herbal remedies that you might find, Chinese herbs. A lot of them contain cordalis. So those are some natural sources of glaucine that you might not think of. And then here's one that I think we've all seen. Anybody here seen this before? Hunan Baiao? Come on, everybody's hand's got to go up. So this is a commonly used bleeder medication. People use it on race day. They stick it in their feed because if they eat it in their feed, technically, that's not administering anything on race day. So a lot of people do still administer Hunan Baiao. There was a horseman in New Jersey that was shook down and had, an old bottle of this, with the label kind of damaged so you couldn't read it. And it was seized, and it was sent off for testing. And it tested positive for glaucine. And the attorney called me and said, he sent me the report, and he said, the trainer has no idea what this could be. And I looked at it, and I said, at the analysis, and the first thing I said was, oh, gosh, there's not that much glaucine in it. This is really low. I don't know why you would have a product in your possession intending to administer glaucine. At this low of a level, it's not going to do anything. And sure enough, when they actually went to the administrative hearing, it was actually determined that was Hunan Baiao. So there's glaucine in that. So what is glaucine? So I'm going to do a Tobin. Y'all are used to this. This is a chemical structure of glaucine. The thing that we care about is down here. There's a nitrogen. That's what makes it alkaline, or be a basic drug. And is this nitrogen that's in the carbon ring. So it's an alkaloid. Alkaloids are phytochemicals produced by plants. Minorex is one. Morphine is another one. Cocaine is another one. So they're phytochemicals that are produced by the plant. They contain this nitrogen molecule, for the most part, within a carbon ring. They're not all exactly the same, but that's the basic thing that makes them an alkaloid. And they're bitter tasting. So the purpose for the plant to produce the alkaloids, for the most part, is to prevent predators, pests, and other forms of disease. So that's what they're for. Now, like morphine, a lot of alkaloids have been determined to be useful pharmacologic products. So glycine, it turns out, is such a thing. It's an antitussive, so it's a cough suppressant, and it's available as a actual product that you can purchase in Eastern Europe. And these are the trade names: broncholitin, bronchocin, bronchotin. And it's used, just like we would use NyQuil if you have a cough, so that you don't cough. Now, ARCI, most antitussives or cough suppressants, are classified as class 4s, which the definition of a class 4, that's one step above a class 5. A class 5 is considered to have no effect on performance, whereas a class 4 is considered to have a very limited ability to influence performance. So despite this class 4 classification, this is actually a class B penalty. So the history of glycine identifications. There was a cluster of glycines called in Pennsylvania, and then it was later dismissed because of the association with the popular shavings. And then in 2016, Maryland and Delaware identified similar clusters, and it was ruled to be contamination. So same thing, they were dismissed, no action was taken. And then in 2016, we also had a group in New York and New Jersey. And those positives kind of sat out there with no action being taken for a very long time. What is it now, 2019? So they're actually now prosecuting 2 of those guys. But there were dozens, if not hundreds, of glycine positives. So one of the reasons why it took them so long to start to investigate this was the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium, RMTC, they formed a task force to investigate the source of glycine. Interestingly, there was no mathematician, statistician, forensic statistician, no expert, epidemiology. There was no one that was proficient in math and statistics that was on this committee. To be, in actuality, the RMTC Scientific Advisory Group has never had, does not today, and has never had a mathematician, statistician, epidemiologist sitting on that committee. So we just all find that curious. That's part of the reason why we were so excited to have Dr. Duer here to explain some math to us. So what they did was, one of the things that the RMTC did was they conducted a study. The University of Pennsylvania's Mary Robinson and Larry Soma, as well as others, they conducted a study, and the source of their poplar trees, incidentally, was Dr. Soma's backyard. So they took these poplar trees and they ground them up into sawdust and leaves and stems and various things, and they put them in horses. The conclusion from their study was that since all urinary concentration from the plant administrations was less than a nanogram per mil, that they would put in a 1 nanogram per mil environmental threshold. So, there's a couple of things. If you're a poplar tree and you're experiencing stress, now stress can come in a number of ways, one of which is a drought. Another form of stress, if your tree is too much water, you can actually take a baseball bat and hit the trunk of the tree, and all of these different forms of stress result in the tree increasing its glycine concentration. So, I don't know if they beat those trees in someone's backyard with baseball bats prior to using them in this experiment, but I'm thinking they didn't include it in their study design, so probably not. So, inside the RMTC scientific black box. So out of dozens of positives for glycine, only one horse was over this randomly chosen 1 nanogram per mil level, which they decided, based on the trees in Dr. Soma's backyard, was the level that should be chosen to demonstrate if this horseman was inappropriately administering some kind of glycine that he imported from Eastern Europe, or ground up some poppies that he picked along the coast, or who knows. But they one horseman in New Jersey and one horseman in New York actually were. So obviously, a single horse is like 2 nanograms per mil. This level, I mean, it's over double the next highest positive horse. So obviously, he had to have done something, right? This isn't just, poplar shavings, surely. So, of course, you know what my answer to that is. So let's talk about how that can happen. How can most of the horses be well below 100 picograms or 1/10 of a nanogram, and then only a few horses between 1/10 and 1/2 a nanogram, and then 1 or 2 between 1/2 and 1, and only 1 over 2. How could that happen if you have the same poplar shavings? And don't forget that there's a whole bunch of horses that are below their ability to test for it, so 0, essentially. So we're going to talk about the normal curve. Everybody remembers this because we were graded on a curve, right? Everybody remember that? So this is a normal distribution. So the average, that's where most people, horses, whatever, sit for anything. And then you have out at these ends, you have, if this was the IQ curve, these are the dummies, and these are the geniuses, right? And this is everybody else, most of them, sitting in this middle part. So a lot of biological characteristics fit a normal distribution. So, for example, height and weight. There's a few skinny people, a few really fat people, and most of the rest of us are in the middle. Interestingly, drug levels don't do this. Drug levels do not fit this bell curve. Why is that? If this is a characteristic of biological units, animals. The reason is because drug levels are determined by multiple factors. So you have, let's use the glycine. They eat the shavings. So you might have horses that have no interest in the shavings, and you may have horses that really like the shavings, and then you have the center of that bell curve, which they can take them or leave them, right? So how much they like the shavings. And then you also have a bell curve when you have the horses that are, once they eat them, they absorb a little, they absorb a lot, or they're kind of in the middle. And then once it gets in the body, how fast does the horse get rid of it? Same thing. There's a few that are doing it a little, and a few that are doing it a lot, and then most of them are in the middle. And what happens is that all of these individual bell curves are multiplied by one another. And what that results is in what's called a log normal distribution. So many, I'm not going to say all, by any stretch of the imagination, so I'll get in trouble from Dr. Duer if I say that, but many drug levels do follow this log normal, meaning you multiply them. So the horses at the far end of the curve are an order of magnitude, or 2 orders of magnitude, higher than the horses at the other end of the bell curve. Does that make sense? And I'm talking about math. I'm trying to make it straightforward. And here's a picture of what a log normal distribution looks like. So most of the animals are falling way down here. This is a random graph that I pulled off of the internet, so that the values don't mean anything, but most of them are way down here at the end. But then there's a few out here at the end, and we'll say it's the horse that really likes the poplar shavings, and then just coincidentally also really absorbs the glycine from the shavings, and then coincidentally also puts a ton of that in the urine. So by the time you have all of those things together, this horse that had the identical exposure to the poplar shavings as these horses, just by an inconvenience of biology, turns out to be way out here. So I actually have these numbers now, but at the time that I did this graph, I didn't have the numbers, and I actually haven't had time to do an analysis on the numbers. But New York published their data on glycine. So down here, this is the numbers, and they had, the horses that were below 100 were not published, so we don't know where they were. But we had 44 between 100 and 500, 9 between 500 and 1,000, and 2 over 1,000. Now, this is our log normal distribution, and this is our Glaucines. 2,000 suddenly doesn't look like it's that high, does it? And so this is the issue with them drawing essentially random thresholds, and I'm hoping that Dr. Duer will comment on this as well, that they drew a random threshold based on a guy's trees in his backyard, and actually, chances are really good that those horses at the very high end, of which there were only very few, were actually within what could be considered normal, because the curve actually fits very well. So again, just because his value was, over double the next highest horse, in fact, that horse, probably just, that poor horseman just probably suffered from having a horse that was at a way outlier of all of those different contributors to his Glaucine level. They're trying to give this guy a year and $10,000. So, and the next highest guy, it's no violation. No purse redistribution, no violation. Okay, so now I'm gonna change gears to a different substance, because this has recently been adopted into the RCI substances, or not endogenous substances, but their uniform classification scheme. So, and this is going to end up being a problem. It's not a problem yet, but we may all see this at some point. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which made hemp production illegal in the United States. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how valuable hemp is, and surely we can tell the difference between hemp and actual marijuana, since the two really, they're the same species but have very few similarities, except for what their leaves look like, which is in the background. So, beginning in 2013, a number of states began pilot programs that permitted hemp production. And these pilot programs did things like feed it to poultry and feed it to cattle, looking at feed conversion ratios. And then in December of 2018, the Hemp Farming Act of 2018 was passed as part of the 2018 Farm Bill. What did that do? What that did is it made hemp legal across the country. So it's now an agricultural commodity, just like corn, oats, and barley. And the National Animal Supplement Council, which is a trade organization for supplement producers, has added hemp products to its list of legitimate ingredients for animal supplements. So why is that a good idea? It's a good idea, and why Congress passed this bill is because hemp can be grown organically. The stalks grow so close together that weeds can't really grow, so there's no need for herbicides. It's naturally because it has alkaloids, or the equivalent of alkaloids, terpenes and cannabinoids, which have the same effect of deterring pests. So you don't have to use herbicides, you don't have to use pesticides, so it can be very readily organically grown without any special care. It uses half the water and produces 4 times as much thread or material as an acre of cotton. Cotton is actually a pretty dirty crop. It makes durable, strong, tensile strength rope. And in 120 days, which is the length of time from planting to harvest of hemp, it can produce the same amount of paper as timber that takes 20 years to grow. So, if you're at all concerned about the environment, about water use, we should all be, in favor of the use of hemp. Byproducts of hemp production can be used to produce a type of concrete called hempcrete, and it's also used in biodiesel and bioplastics. So this is really great. A byproduct of textile production and a byproduct of paper production and a byproduct of the hempcrete and biodiesel and bioplastic is the other parts of the plant, one of which includes the seeds, some of which is called, they're hemp cakes, which is what's left over after they've pressed all the oil and harvested all the seeds, and they actually can use those for feed for cattle. And then a lot of times it's used as bedding for horses. It's actually commonly used in Europe as bedding for horses, and apparently it's taken quite a hold in Wellington for show horses. So it's a good source of bedding. The actual dehulled seeds, which is one of the byproducts of the fiber production, contain almost no THC or cannabidiol or other cannabinoids. Hemp seeds are an excellent source of protein, containing complete protein. What does that mean? Corn and oats contain very little lysine. Lysine is almost always added to horse feed. Lysine is an essential amino acid, so without it, an animal can't produce proper muscle, can't lay down the foundation for anything, because they require lysine. There is very little lysine in what we typically consider animal feed: oats, corn, barley, very little lysine, not that much methionine. Those are present in hemp seeds as a complete protein, so it's an excellent source. They're also an excellent source of omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, and it contains less than 5% saturated fats. We don't have to worry about heart disease in horses, but there's lots of other good reasons to provide omega-3 and 6. So I just gave you a sales pitch on hemp. Full spectrum hemp oil is oil pressed not just from the seeds. So hemp seed oil has very little, and this is where it gets complicated, and this is going to get asked, because everybody in this room is going to end up with probably a CBD positive, and you're going to go, what are you feeding your horse? So hemp seed oil has a similar nutritional profile to the seeds, very little THC, very little cannabidiol. Full spectrum hemp oil is pressed not just from the seeds, but also the other leftover parts of the plant, so some of the leaves. You know, the advantages for, well, you or your dog or your horse, not your racehorse, for the full spectrum hemp oil is it does contain all of the really beneficial terpenes, alkaloids, phytochemicals that are present in the plant. The hemp seed oil probably has very few of those. Hemp seed oil is clear. It looks like corn oil almost. Full spectrum hemp oil is green. So it does contain, but the THC has to fall below 0.3% by law. Incidentally, 0.3% will probably get you a positive test. In practice, most hemp products contain way less than 0.3%. More interesting is there's a huge difference between hemp oil and CBD oil. So early in the research into hemp, CBD, or cannabidiol, was identified as the effective ingredient or phytochemical for the anti-seizure activity of hemp. And so they isolated it, and they actually went through an FDA approval for an anti-seizure drug that was approved almost a year ago. But even though there's now an FDA-approved product, there are still companies that are producing CBD oil. CBD oil is not full-spectrum hemp oil or hemp oil. CBD is typically purified CBD or cannabidiol, and it's typically added back to either olive oil or soy oil at a level of 20 to 80%. So it's not even added back to hemp oil. And the reason that's significant, same thing, you have a positive test and you go in the barn and somebody shows you what they have. If it's CBD oil, you know, that's probably something they should stay away from, because CBD oil has got CBD added in a pure form, and interestingly, the FDA has actually sent out a dozen warning letters to companies making CBD oil. That's not full-spectrum hemp oil, although probably the full-spectrum hemp oil is likely to also give you a positive test. Hemp oil, which is just from the seeds, is unlikely to give you a positive test, although unfortunately, despite all of the advantages, is probably worth avoiding. So, based on no science whatsoever, the RMTC Scientific Advisory Group decided to make CBD a Class 2B. So we don't know that it does anything to horses. We do not have a provision for a screening limit, so that if a horse does, say, eat its bedding, and its bedding happens to be hemp bedding, and gets a CBD positive for that, there is no screening limit. So the fact that the United States Congress just made this legal, it's still as illegal as if it was marijuana in horses. So the RMTC has successfully returned the status of hemp to pre-Hemp Farming Act, or the Farm Bill status. They've made it back to a controlled substance. Again, it's really crazy to make things that can be randomly taken into the horse from the environment into Class 2Bs. Interestingly, some of the other advantages of hemp for feeding is that it actually decreases the methane production in cattle, so that you have less pollution produced by the cows if you feed them hemp, and it improves the meat and egg quality if you feed it to poultry, but it has not yet been approved by the FDA for feeding to those animals for mass production, but some of the early research is showing lots of really good benefits of hemp. So what I'm hoping is that eventually the RMTC, with our pressure, will be able to adopt screening limits so that the inadvertent sources, such as bedding, such as hemp oil, with tiny amounts of these substances, will not result in positive tests.
You know, the CBD is now ubiquitous in our society. I mean, there are stores, you can drive around their store. There's some suggestion that it's helpful for arthritis, and I take it myself for that. I can't say that I've noticed any remarkable effects, but I'm trying something.
The FDA is likely to eventually. Repeat your.
Dr. Duer just pointed out that CBD oil is very prominent in stores throughout the U.S., and he said he takes it himself, trying to get the anti-inflammatory benefits, but hasn't noticed much yet.
But I haven't noticed dramatic effects.
This all came out of actually a CBD positive in Kentucky, and I'm fairly confident that they gave the new recommendation of 2 weeks and $5,000 as a penalty to that person for the CBD positive.
Do you know anything about Olympic regulations?
The World Anti-Doping Agency, it is not classified. It is not a violation, and they have no intention of making it a violation.
I think Dr. Rake, you want to have a question?
U.S. anti-doping has taken a position that it is not a performance-enhancing. Coaches around the country have basically said this is a good thing for your athletes. This is a nice alternative to non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. It may improve sleep. You know, so here you have something that is a naturally occurring substance that probably is beneficial to your horse. And RMTC is taking this position.
I'm hopeful. Because the NASC is a trade organization and they're supporting its use, I am hopeful that at some point our group can, meaning actually all of the three of us sitting here, can do some studies and determine what some kind of a screening limit and hopefully have it adopted by RCI. I don't know that they haven't been very helpful whenever we've suggested changing thresholds or screening limits, but we keep trying.
That leads us to Dr. Duer's presentation, and while he's getting ready, I will say that I proved that I'm on the far left side of the bell curve by not introducing Eric Hamelback, our CEO, as part of this panel. So after Dr. Duer speaks, Eric will speak.
Well, and while Dr. Duer's heading, I would also, in full disclosure, say that I've been on CBD oil for quite some time for my minor surgeries I had back in December. I think I've had some results. I also paint it on my knees. Thus far, I've been on it for quite a while. So yeah.
I just want.
And hemp fields make extremely good dove fields. So I would slide that into your slide.
One of the insane things, both with the glycine and the CBD, is these are Class B violations. You know, if you want to make these things a Class C, or, you know, more appropriately, a fine, and maybe this horse doesn't need to be bedded on poplar. I mean, there are entire operations in the eastern mid-Atlantic area where people have gone to a lot more expensive bedding in order to avoid bedding on poplar. I bet on poplar in Kentucky, and I've had my poplar tested, and it doesn't have any glycine in it. They're obviously not very stressed trees. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to get stressed trees at some point and have a positive for glycine. It's insane to have no violation at one level and a Class B violation at another.
We're going to hold off on questions until everybody gets done presenting, and then we should have some time for that. Don't want to cut Dr. Duer short, or Eric, so.
Which is a slide forward?
Which button was the slide forward, Clara?
The right.
This one.
That, yeah.
Forgot I checked your chair.
Well, I'd like to thank the Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association for the opportunity to be here. It's my honor. And Dr. Fenger and Dr. Tobin have been speaking about indigenous compounds, and the first indigenous compound to be studied numerically to suggest thresholds was salicylic acid, which which occurs in plants and such as mint leaves, methyl salicylate, oil of wintergreen, and that area presents a unique problem, which requires really practical observation, as some of Dr. Tobin's and Dr. Finger's slides have demonstrated. You can't obtain a realistic threshold just from giving say salicylic acid administrations. You can't obtain a realistic thresholds because there are other considerations coming from the feed. That's why from drug administrations, salicylic acid was first set at a level of 650, and very shortly thereafter, it was raised to 750 because of the extra considerations that needed to be given due to the feed. What I'm going to focus on is not so much the indigenous compounds, because that's a more of a random process that requires practical observations on a day-to-day basis. What I'd like to focus on is what underlies the well, what I've said there, what is the basis for exceeding the regulatory threshold? What I'd like to focus on is aspects relating to the setting of those thresholds for substances that are unlikely to come from indigenous compounds, but are more likely to come from administration of the to the horse. I'd like to back up 1 second. I don't think it included in this slide. I meant to, but not soon enough. Over 200 years ago, there was a British scientist, William Thomson, who's the founder of our temperature scale. But what he said was, when you measure something, what you're speaking about, and express it in numbers, you know something about it. When you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced the stage of science. Now, one of the worst, probably the worst underlying problem that you're faced with on a daily basis is that the powers that be that set these thresholds are unwilling to divulge the data, the experimental data upon which they're based. And as William Thomson, later called Lord Kelvin, said more or less, I mean, you can't talk about it if you don't have the number. And I think it's deplorable that the organizations that are setting these levels don't publish the data, the experimental data, the drug administration data that this was given on. But be that as may, I know that Dr. Fenger and Dr. Tobin have done serious attempts, and also Dr. Malin in New York to try to obtain data. I've written letters to scientists in, several scientists in the United States, also Hong Kong, also Australia. The only person who was willing to cooperate with me was a Dr. Hibbard in Australia concerning carbon dioxide data. But be that as may, I mean, that's the tough nut to crack. And so what these levels really should be set on, as in this slide, the probability of exceeding a threshold is based upon the threshold set for the concentration data resulting from the medication or substance trials and the statistical method used in setting it. And that's how it should be set. But without the data, you don't know. And problems of setting the threshold arise from the choices of mathematical statistics used in setting that threshold. Dr. Fenger showed a graph there and mentioned the normal distribution, and then often what is done is if you have a graph of that appears to be not normal, then logarithms are taken. But to get a graph that appears to look like something more normal, but I have a doctor's degree in physical science, in physical chemistry, and my professor told me that if you take the logarithm of something enough times, you will get a straight line. or whatever, you'll get the curve that you want. But there's no need, especially today, to do these assumptions. There hasn't been any need to make those assumptions since the 1800s. There was a French scientist, Bien-Aimé, and a Russian scientist, Chebyshev, who came up with a remarkable true observation, provable by probability theory, a rugged mathematical derivation without these serious assumptions, such as normality or log normal. What they found was that if you want to know what they found was that the probability of exceeding the mean or average value by some constant times the standard deviation. Again, the standard deviation is to measure the width of your data. If you take that, the probability of exceeding the mean of your data by, or the probability of your data differing from the mean, let's say it's probability of your threshold differing from the mean of your administration data by more than k times k, a constant, times the standard deviations, is equal to 1 over k squared. And that is good for, valid for any distribution. I mean, it doesn't have to be normal, log normal, whatever. That could be used. I mean, probably why it hasn't been used is it gives thresholds that subjectively some consider too lenient. Probably. That's one of the reasons it hasn't been used. But that was 2 centuries ago. In this century, from probably the 1980s, a professor at Stanford University, Efron, came up with a technique in treating data by enormous number of statistical calculations on that data to come up with your best estimate of the standard deviation of your data. I mean, it's not just what you have in these distributions is you may go measure 20 horses. Well, that may not give you the result of all horses. You can measure another 20 horses, you'll get a different, slightly different, somewhat different average, somewhat different mean, whatever. But anyway, to somewhat to overcome that problem, Efron uses random sampling on the original data to arrive at a more reliable estimate of the standard deviation of the data. That technique can be, in my opinion, should be used today rather than these techniques from, well, let's say techniques from a previous century, last century, assuming the normal distribution, assuming the log normal distribution. But that's one of the things that I've been working on with Dr. Fenger, Dr. Tobin, Dr. Malin, and some others. In this table, on the left-hand column, it mentions substance. The second row in this table is for flunixin, the data of, from the data of Stanley et al. And from their data, they came up with a threshold of 22.9 nanogram per mil of flunixin. However, that is corresponding, I mean, I've used their data, that is corresponding to a probability of 0.0271 of exceeding the threshold. But what that probability means in a practical sense is if you use that threshold, you can expect to exceed that threshold 2.7% of the time. You can expect that you'll be falsely accusing about 3% of the people using that data. Going down to the next row, salicylic acid. If you use the original Moss data to come up with a threshold for salicylic acid, that if you use that with the RMTC-like calculation, you come up with 13.6, whereas the level is really set at 750 based on all other considerations. But that 13.6, if you use that, you could come up with, you could expect to be falsely accusing 2.85% of the people, almost 3% of the people, horses, whatever, would be false, trainers would be falsely accused of over-medicating their horse. Going down to the cobalt there, data, using the RMTC method for that, the so-called 95-95 method, results in a 2.98 parts per billion threshold with a probability of 0.0001. Well, if I use that data, if I use that probability with the cobalt data in the last column there, like I calculate with that probability 1 in 10,000, what I consider that to mean is that the threshold should be 66.4, not 2.98. And this is just some reiteration. One can see that for each substance, that using a Kramer threshold, that is, Kramer was a Swedish mathematician in the early 1900s. That's really, Kramer's book was talking about Chebyshev and Benamier. But the threshold results in a threshold that is higher than those that have been published. That means less risk of being falsely accused. And that just reiterates what I was saying. Like, taking the cobalt data for an example and using what's called the Chebyshev equation with the RMTC-like 95-95 threshold of 2.98 results in the probability of exceeding this is 0.70. 70% of the accusations would be false. And taking the cobalt data for an example and using the Chebyshev equation with a threshold of 66.4 results in the probability of exceeding this as 2 out of 10,000 or 1 out of 5,000 accusations to be false. But really I think what the administrators should do is decide how many false accusations, what percentage their accusations they tolerate to be false? What percentage of innocent trainers they feel that it's morally correct to falsely accuse and do that? I mean, no threshold would be perfect, but I mean, if you set it high enough at a reasonable level, you're going to have more morally correct false accusations. That's what I think in a nutshell. But the whole thing is obtaining the data.
Thank you, Dr. Duer.
Thank you.
Yes, that's fine.
The next speaker is Eric Hamelback, and Eric is going to speak about something that is a perceived need in the industry, which is a way to communicate to stewards some of the, I was going to say complications, but I'm going to say scientific subtleties of the greatly expanding role of the chemist, their ability to identify traces of substances, and how to correctly identify the significance of an identification with respect to a regulatory process. And in that regard, Hugh Gallagher is running a seminar in Delaware, I believe, in April, mid-April, and for one reason or another, I've been invited to speak, and Eric is going to speak about formalizing that process at the national level, I believe.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. And certainly I thank all of the panelists here today. It's been, once again, very educational. And hopefully the stage may flip me over because all the brain matter is sitting over there. I'm going to be certainly the one with just full of BS behind my name, no other significant titles. But I wanted to talk to you about something that I consider very serious. Also, I would say that I've been working on this project mentally for quite some time, and then I started putting it on paper, getting some advice, and then formalizing it in an action plan, and then started passing it around to a few folks that ultimately felt as if it was a very positive move. Certainly worth talking about. If it comes to fruition, that'd be amazing. But ultimately, I also believe that, working together, not worrying about who gets credit for it, but if it works and if it's better for the industry, then we'll push forward. So, not to create another acronym, because obviously our industry is full of them, what I developed in my mind and started putting down on paper was eventually I termed the Stewards Advisory and Review Committee, so the SARC. I see this as a proposal to establish a public and private collaboration that would function as a resource to review and interpretation and the support for stewards. So my goal here is to look at the purpose for the proposal and also to help define the membership that would be established. And I'd like to already borrow a phrase from Dr. Duer. I think a lot of this revolves around what he mentioned, practical observations. So the suggested purpose, develop and maintain legally and scientifically a medically sound standards of practice, such as the Stewards Advisory Review Committee, and they may be called upon to counsel in 3 areas: policy, practice, and analysis. The members of the SARC would represent a cross-section of regulatory officials, equine veterinarians, equine pharmacologists, and equine toxicologists who are recognized as leaders in their field. So the current optics, and I'll try to define what I see and what I think many people see as the possible need. Obviously, we want to ensure our industry's integrity, and it is essential for all of our equine testing to work properly. The critical task of determining the validity of a test result should be to those who are and have been working and understanding the legal and technical issues that are involved. So by utilizing a SARC program or a SARC committee as an advisory board for the stewards, the Racing Commission, and the equine medical directors, I believe it could provide assistance based on experience and knowledge of precedential cases, thus aiding in making determinations for accuracy and possible violations that are found within a biological sample. One of the questions I was asked early on is, again, the ownership of this idea. and I haven't defined that. And as I just said earlier, I think it's very important that, if we're working on something to try to make the industry better, it doesn't, in my mind, come down to ownership or looking to see who gets credit for establishing it. So this proposal is really set forth to emulate a similar resource of entities that we find in human testing. And I think all of us in this room in particular are well aware of Ted Schultz. Ted Schultz has been certainly very active in recent cases with us. Most recently in my mind is case in Minnesota. So when I really started working on this idea, I went straight to Ted Schultz, who of course is the director for the medical review officers, and they oversee the U.S. Department of Transportation workplace drug and alcohol testing programs. So again, in my opinion, the decision made on these findings is certainly as critical as the finding itself. So I define it as three main functions of the SARC. Information and policy advisory. So the SARC members will be able to review the findings sent to them from a requesting body, thus be able to advise and recommend possible next step procedures and policy based from the members' interpretation, members being the SARC committee. I do want to make it very clear. Again, one of the questions that I was asked very early on and somewhat challenged, this committee is not being assembled to have or hold any regulatory authority. I think a lot of you guys are aware that I am a high school football official, and I really base this on something similar to what you guys would know or think of as an instant replay booth. This is a backup for your stewards that if they have a question, if they have something that they find and they don't have a precedent, this group could be a great advisory resource for them. So recommended practices and ruling advisory as the second function. I think the SARC would be intended to provide a responsive resource for the stewards, which is not currently available. This is not something that we have currently. I think there are entities right now that would say they feel as if they're available for that, but we all know that certain entities that make that proclamation live under a confidentiality agreement. And again, it is not intended to replace any function currently provided by an authority, current authority. Also, I think a function would be to help as an advisory for laboratory findings. The SARC would combine the expertise of the members, again, from equine toxicologists and pharmacologists to provide practical advice on the current information regarding the drug analysis and the proceedings that are found from within the industry, and again, precedential information that they have. So again, I see the SARC duties really as defined upon the request from the Board of Stewards or the governing body that has the jurisdiction. So the first three, I would say, I see, review the submitted biological samples and the results, advise and confirm a split specimen analysis, and I think we heard a little bit of the difficulties that are coming around under that aspect yesterday. Review the results and consider suggesting further testing. So the SARC would not likely establish specific procedures to review findings, but it will ensure the SARC review for each specimen is consistent and complete. In addition, I see the SARC serving as a common point of contact between the representing Board of Stewards and the governing regulatory jurisdiction. So I also see duties as being defined as keeping records of the drug test and information, obviously extremely confidential, evaluation of the possible circumstances that may have led to the test identification, and this is where I feel the experience of the precedential information comes to play. If you have the right people on this committee, and we're all thinking, or at least we all should be thinking, about environmental transfer positives. Again, I'll point to some of the recent cases in Minnesota. If we have the advisory group that can advise stewards and possibly in an appeal racing commissioners themselves, this group should have the expertise to at least advise how they would or how they have seen other cases proceed. So consider any and all possibilities, another duty, to explain the test identification and offer a final assessment and recommendation to the requesting Board of Stewards and governing regulatory jurisdiction. So as you can see, it's a very simple concept. I certainly don't see this as something that is going to be easy to put together, but it's a simple concept. And if you truly think about it, at least in the way I'm trying to present it, or in my head, it is a group that can, for instance, be sitting at a table or in our world on a conference call. If you have a steward question from Kentucky, they're looking at a test or a violation that they have, and they want to get some advice. I think this group is set up and poised to do so. So as Dr. Tobin said, I'm trying to finalize this and actually have also been asked to give this presentation at the ARCI in April as well. Because again, Ed Martin was one of the individuals that I've shown this to, and he feels that it does have very good merit. There's been several stewards. I wouldn't say that ROPE is endorsing anything, but I've gone to ROPE. I sit on the education committee for ROPE, and I think that there is, in the very near future, a step process that we presented to the ROPE board. So hopefully we'll get some traction. I'd love to get feedback, not necessarily right now, because I want everybody to have time for questions and also get to the races. But it is important for me. I gave a similar but shortened down version of this at the NARV conference back this summer, and it was also well received by a few racetrack veterinarians. So I think it has merit. I'm certainly not an attorney to know how to set this project up. But I do think that if we do it right, it has very, very good merit for our industry. So I want to open up the floor for questions for the panel. Mary Ann.
First of all, thank you, Eric, for bringing this idea nationally, because it's something I've been trying to do in Washington for probably 15 years. With very little success. I've had success in writing it in rule that the state veterinarian must consult with a scientific advisory before making a recommendation to the stewards. and also that the stewards must consult as well. The problem that I've seen is the stewards, no fault of their own, don't have the education to know who is an expert, nor does our commission on appeal. The last case, we had the HBPA brought in Dr. Tobin, and a decision was made based on the commission looked that the people that we were bringing forth were trying to get people off. Even with, I mean, they can't even understand contamination when it's blatant. And they go to a practicing vet that is now a regulatory vet as their expert. They go to an executive director of a threshold setting agency as an expert over scientists. So I think if it comes from the ARCI endorsing it, it will have a lot more wheels, that it's actually trying to be fair and not trying to people get off. So any way I can help get this going, count me in. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Doug, in the back.
I have two thoughts about this. I commend you, number one, for going forward on it. But from a legal perspective, there is the way that one would go about it is to look at it on the regulatory side and how to get the scientific viewpoint, perhaps alternative to what RMTC does, perhaps not, perhaps they align. But you would go at it from the legislative side, what I call legislative, I think of legislative and judicial functions. The stewards function more of a judicial capacity. Yes, they're an arm of the commission, but they function on a case-by-case basis. Whereas when they are making rules up on the front end, they're making rules that apply to everybody. Now, those rules may not be well informed, and there may be the need for getting better information to the rulemaking process on the front end, and SARC would certainly be able to do that or provide a different voice than just the RMTC, where commissions sometimes choose to follow everything that the RMTC does just because it's the gospel in their minds. And so I would suggest to you to think in terms of the legal framework of where SARC fits in. And if it's intended to fit on both the front end and the rulemaking capacity, that's a whole different kind of a function than functioning on the back end where you're working with the stewards only and you're working on a case-by-case basis. And if it goes in on the back end on a case-by-case basis, then you need to think in terms of what the local jurisdictional rules are with respect to advice being given to the stewards outside of the record process. Most jurisdictions have a requirement that their judicial functions are to be maintained in an unbiased fashion, and a way that one can create a bias to it is to have consulting that occurs outside of the record review.
Sure.
You can bring in experts. The horseman can bring in an expert. Theoretically, the state vet might function as a prosecutorial expert on the other side, even if they don't really know what they're talking about. You have any number of ways of getting expert proof on a case-by-case basis, but it does need to occur in the record of that case, so that if it goes on appeal to the commission has got a record to go, and if it goes from the commission on into the court system, they got a record of the experts' opinions who've gotten consulted and brought into that record. So that would be the structure I would advise you to think in terms of how SARC could function. Which role does it play, or perhaps both, but if it's playing it on the back end, it needs to think in terms of having experts such as those on your panel here who would be qualified to be credentialed as experts and recognized as experts who then get their testimony or their views put into the record of that individual horseman's case.
Thank you, Doug.
Doug, what about, I have a question for you, since you brought up the topic. If it's on the back end, I think potentially it could be before the ruling is issued. So it's not during the hearing process,
Right.
but before the ruling's issued, they get the advice to make the penalty structure more fair. Would that still create the same legal hassles that, the hurdles that you just?
I didn't want to necessarily to fully get into that part of the discussion, but Dave, I think Dave and I think alike. This is that advisory role. I see it I see it before the actual steward's hearing. I see this, again, as someone reaching out to a group, even before, because obviously this group is still going to act as, and most likely will be, expert witness for testimony once a hearing occurs. I'm trying to put something in place prior to. But I do call it a public-private partnership because I think there is some governance that needs to be involved in the makeup of the process. So, Peter is back.
Advisory committee like that Kentucky has when they have the committee, so when they're making up rules or suggesting rules of commission. What we envisioned this to be was something that the stewards could pick up the phone and say, hey, look, we've got this situation. What do your experts think? And the people that are on this, that Eric has suggested to be on it, are all people to be recognized as experts in a hearing situation. Besides, in addition to which, there would also be some people with practical experience that could help out a steward that maybe is just on there, just was appointed. So,
Sorry, all the way up front, Audrey, Frank, and then Maria.
I think I look at it the same way Doug does. I'm the lawyer representing the trainer. I'm the lawyer representing the trainer who's looking at a possible violation for whatever. I want to be able to represent that person in a fair forum. What you're suggesting to me is not a fair forum. You're getting advice outside of that forum. How am I going to challenge what this committee is telling you? I mean, that the whole adversarial process is you got a lawyer on this side or a prosecutor on this side and a lawyer on this side. They present all of their arguments, all of their evidence in a forum so I can challenge their side, they can challenge my side, the judges can decide, the stewards. But here you're suggesting that, well, the stewards are going to have some information available to them outside this forum, and I won't be able to test it whatsoever. That's the problem with it.
Okay.
I can tell you that I've kind of used this process because I've found that my stewards in West Virginia are not well educated because the Racing Commission, and I don't mean to bash the West Virginia Racing Commission, but the Racing Commission doesn't do a good job of educating their stewards when it comes to medication issues specifically. And so through the help of Dr. Tobin and Dr. Fenger, I've been able to get information to provide to the stewards to not try and convince them to go a different way, but to give them facts so that they have a well-rounded pool of information from which to make their decisions. And they're grateful for that, actually. My stewards have been grateful for that because, again, they don't get enough information, other than what's in the Pollock report or whatever they read. I don't know what they read. But it has been helpful for me when I've been trying to work through an appeal to funnel that information to them first, and then they can take it, they can digest it, and then when it comes time for the hearing, they use some of that information. They don't necessarily, suck up to whatever the horsemen want, but they do consider that information as part of their decision. So it's worked for me in Charlestown.
I was going to make the comment when Maria interjected that the concept in professional world is continuing education, and this would be an educational opportunity for stewards. Is that a correct interpretation? Eric?
Yes, yes.
That
I
would
don't
be-
want to, I don't want to compare it to rope, but essentially, to me, it is a.
That would be one of its functions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful, and I don't think that would interfere with the legal process, would it? Or I'm obviously outside my expertise, but if we have an educational process for stewards that we contribute to, that doesn't interfere with the actual adversarial process.
So, and again, a suggestion is you'd be better to partner with Rope perhaps in the sense that you say, hey, can we do this as a continuing ed sort of thing or a certification thing? You know, because they have to do that anyway. They have to get their points.
Right,
So,
I got two comments. The first one is, at the steward level, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I sure work for a bunch of them. The administrative law level is de novo in every state. And so at that level, you could begin your judicial record. So this would almost be irrelevant to the case to inform the stewards, number one. And number two, the Joe Sharp case that has recently been in the news that I was the expert for, where the negative control sample in the laboratory tested positive for methamphetamine. In that particular case, I don't think that there's an expert, certainly not one sitting at this table, and once it's explained to a steward what the purpose of the negative control is, that is to demonstrate that the methamphetamine in your sample was not put in there by the laboratory. Once that explained to the stewards, that case should have never seen the light of day. And it would have saved Joe Sharp probably $20,000.
Marty?
This is a worthwhile discussion, but the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now is what happened at Santa Anita, and this being the medication panel, is there some idea or plan to put out some sort of a press release and explain? Because I'm sure our horsemen throughout the nation are wondering, how is this going to impact racing at the end of the day? And I'm sure many other jurisdictions are now going to contemplate this. And I just wondered if perhaps Dr. Fenger or Dr. Tobin or Dave or yourself could explain how are we going to address this on behalf of the horsemen in the nation.
Well, I'll just open it up. I mean, we worked quite a bit through the night on setting up a statement, got input from a lot of folks, and then I think there was, and even in my own mind, a little bit of a let's wait until the morning, until we fire something out. I've teed up to speak on the radio with Steve Bick. I know Alan Foreman is probably on, and Steve Christ has been on. So I think that there is definitely a plan to make a statement. There has been some reserve that the National HBPA doesn't have an affiliate, nor do we have boots on the ground in California, but I agree with you from the standpoint of this is again, and I kind of said this to Dave in a different context, but this is certainly a we problem and not a me problem. I think there's obviously a lot of holes in what the Stronach Group did, but I also think it's very important to manage the crisis so that it doesn't backfire on us as well. And I think we're going to have to be very thoughtful in what we say and be diligent in standing up for what we believe in. So it's a tough statement to make. Mrs. Harrington? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry first.
Yeah, my thought is, I mean, it's a great thought, but, you know, the stewards, they've got big egos, you know.
Well, let me, I didn't mean to jump back in front of there. I kind of wanted to, well, Mrs. Harrington asked the question, but I really wanted, especially Dr. Fenger, to kind of weigh in on the comment from Marty.
Yeah, the comment from me is the North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians is similarly working on a press release from our organization. The issue essentially is by focusing on eliminating Lasix or further restricting medications. If this group of breakdowns has proven one thing, it has proven that the breakdowns are not medication related. And the reason I can say that is California was one of the early adopters of the RMTC medication regulations, and it has made not one iota difference in their breakdown rate. The only thing that they've done that changed the breakdown rate in California was the synthetic tracks. But even with still having Golden Gate with a relatively low breakdown rate because of the Tapeta surface, they still have a higher breakdown rate than any other jurisdiction in the country, despite being one of the early adopters. If it was medication, they would have had a drop in their breakdown rate. It's clearly the surface, and that clearly needs to be addressed with more proactive measures. And to be honest, the veterinarians are looking at also implementing some kind of requirement for pre-work evaluations, but not by the state veterinarian, a pre-work evaluation by the practicing veterinarian. So that is one of the thing that is they're talking about, because some of the breakdowns are related to trainers, meaning trainers, obviously, some trainers have more breakdowns than others. So that may be a contributing factor.
And unfortunately, the filly that did break down yesterday, she was under their new pre-screening evaluation. She was one of the first to have a slip put in, 24 hours. She was evaluated, and she worked and she broke down. So again, I think the other problem that I have with Mrs. Stronach's statement is that they didn't wait for the autopsy results to come back. To my knowledge, even some of the earlier horses that have broke down, I don't know that they've received any autopsy results. So therefore, I think she's clearly putting the blame on medication and possibly whips, crops, without, once again, any factual backup as to why you're doing that. But I don't want to interrupt Mrs. Harrington.
Well, my point being is that there's no data, like Dr. Duer said. If you don't have data and you don't have 20 some odd serum levels, toxicology, histopathology on tendons and ligaments, prior minor injuries that went unnoticed, if you don't have any of this data, you really have to be very thoughtful in making a statement, because it's just everybody's opinion and no data.
Exactly.
So my thought is, you make some generic statement, but make it so that it can't be picked apart because you're making a statement that has no data. That's my point.
And I agree. While we're waiting to get Dr. Walmsley the phone, I think that it played a very similar role in the statement we made as just being supportive, the one we made last week. And so I think this is teeing up to be a little bit more of a generic statement, but based on the fact, or I think we base it on the fact that there isn't any proof for what they've done so far. We should certainly close the track, do what's best for the horse, and everything needs to be evaluated. And that's it for right now.
It seems to me, in a germane point that I have not heard raised, is the fact that if the Stronach people really think that medication's the cause of the breakdowns at Santa Anita, what changes have they made in their medication rules at other Stronach tracks, Gulfstream, Laurel, places like that? Obviously, no changes have been made there. So, that's an inconsistency that needs to be pointed out.
Yeah, that's been pointed out tremendously on social media. I mean, that was one of the first avenues that was attacked hard by folks like us, that, some of it in a joking fashion, that, oh, don't you know, horses only don't bleed in California. But it was slammed really hard, and if you get a chance to read the TDN this morning, there was a very good write-up and a bullet point back and forth with Bill Finley about the problems with the statement that Mrs. Stronach, I can't call her Mrs. Stronach, that's Belinda made. So, Ed, I think, Ed in the back, did you raise your hand? Nope, sorry. Did you guys want to say anything else about the statement?
As far as the data, there's been no association between Lasix and breakdowns, over the course of years and years and years. So we do know quite confidently that there's no association.
And that actually, John Moss and I were talking about this recently. There's a certain high-profile blogger that I won't mention his name, but he had a very good Q&A with Dr. Bramlage, or the entire Q&A was not with Dr. Bramlage, but he very clearly stated that point. There's no association in research in horses with Lasix and breakdowns, and he went as far as to truly disclaim what some had been pointing to, that Lasix weakened bones, which happened to be a human study. He went into a very in-depth conversation on calcium as to how that was not true, that statement was completely not true, and eventually in a second study after the fact was proven not true. So again, unfortunately, I think for us, especially some of us that are really in the social media world, we are playing on emotions of folks who really don't understand. We're certainly playing on the emotions and anger from the animal rights extremist. And so again, it is a delicate balance on what you put out there, because you don't want it to come back as an attack on the organization either. And you certainly don't want to exacerbate the situation. So it is a fine line, and unfortunately, I think social media has really caused that. But without question, Marty, we're going to say something, and in many ways, we already have been, so.
Well, it just seems like you have the opportunity here with Dr. Fenger and Dr. Tobin to develop something that could be perhaps presented to the board meeting.
So that, because I can tell you, there's many horsemen have called Rick and I already and wondering, what are we going to do about this? This is dangerous. Everybody thinks perhaps it could escalate. And I understand and I appreciate what you're saying, but the lines have been drawn for years. We've got the ones who are against it and those of us that feel therapeutic medication is important to the horse. And I appreciate what you're saying, and perhaps I'm a little emotional about it, but at the same time, I do think that here you have the opportunity where the horsemen throughout the country are here, and I think something should come out of this meeting at this point in time. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Aaron.
This incident is very similar to the acute deaths in polo ponies in South Florida a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And at the
Selenium.
AEP, who is the American Association of Equine Practitioners, never made a statement as to what it was, but they never made the statement as to what it wasn't. A lot of people were calling me and saying, well, what is it, what is it? If they had only made the statement what it wasn't, would have been really helpful. And the other thing is University of Florida had all the data, and they never released it. So I don't know who you could contact that would have any questions as to the early necropsies on these horses?
We've been talking to Alan Balch, I've been talking to Alan Balch, and he has not passed on any of the early results as of yet to me, and possibly they are out there at this point, but and some conversations that we even had up to yesterday, he was more focused on bullet pointing what Belinda Stronach had put out. But that is my avenue for trying to get that information, so. All right, any more questions? Well, then I will wrap up the convention. I think that it has been another very successful, I hope you think, successful convention. We've had some great topics, certainly some great discussions, and I really want to thank our media coverage. In particular, we have Jenny Reese here, who's not only writing for National, she's also writing for the TDN, and also we have Frank Angst from the Blood Horse, who his coverage of the first day between Jenny and Frank was pretty amazing. So we appreciate that. We appreciate you guys being here, trying to keep our message out, trying to keep it positive, and especially in this trying time.